Welcome back. So I just want to kind of talk a little bit about the Entity framework and how it actually works behind the scenes before we start making tests for this to kind of prove why I'm doing what I'm doing. First of all, when we're working with the Entity framework, when we call an add function right here on that context, what actually happens is it goes in and it sets something called the state on this object to actually be added. Now there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, so I've tried to make a small drawing just to try and explain how I see the process is for the Entity framework when you call this add function on a context. So let's try and jump into a drawing, but now you know what I'm trying to kind of talk about, the context add function, right? What does that actually do for you in the Entity framework core? Now here I tried to kind of extend my drawing a little bit. In the beginning I just talked about calling SQL to C# code, but let's try and have a talk about what actually happens right here. When I call that add function, the context right there, what actually happens is it puts it into something they call the ChangeTracker, right? And the ChangeTracker is kind of a local database, a local data set that kind of builds up until you call save changes. So what the add does for you is actually it goes in, it creates the information that was added, and it also adds this new object to the ChangeTracker if it's not already there, to the list, and then in the end it sets the state to add it. And if you don't believe me again, let me try and jump back to the code and jump into this add function. You'll notice here it says when you call the add, I do some magic and then I call entity state type of added. So it means that when I'm done, it kind of has a reference in some kind of ChangeTracker that knows that this specific object right here I just created now has the state of added. Now what does that mean? That means that when I'm later on, when I call save changes on the context, let me just try and do it in the code again, right here just to show you. So let's jump back to our code. Now what we end up doing when we're done with everything we want to do is we want to call save changes, and we're actually going to probably do it async, but let's just do it the simple way right now. And when that happens, when we call the save changes later on, it's actually going to go and take everything inside the ChangeTracker and convert that into an SQL query. And since we have the added keyword right here, it'll know that the query should probably be something like insert into blah blah blah, something SQL-ish, and that, in our case, it should be insert into, we even know it's going to be location, that's the table, and then you could keep going. If you're good at SQL, you could just write that query where you put in the different parameters that you need. But again, that's kind of the steps that I want to fake in my unit test. So I'm going to fake that we call the add function, and that's going to kind of make a ChangeTracker understand that now we have the state added for this setup right here. Now the reason we don't want to kind of, like Microsoft said, I told you last lesson, we don't want to dive in and create everything that we're doing for the ChangeTracker. Is because if we start doing that and they make a change later for the ChangeTracker, we'll have to also update all our code. But still, it makes sense to say, at least in my mind, it makes sense to say when you call the add function, you should kind of have it like a ChangeTracker list or something like that, where you save the data into, and then later when you call the save changes, you should move that ChangeTracker data into the database, right? That's kind of the steps that I want to do, and call some kind of SQL query or something. It might not be an SQL query, it could be an actual Mongo database, or it could just be I don't know, a different type of query for storing data into a document-based database, right? I don't care. What I want to know is that when I call the add function, it should kind of add something to a list for the DB set. So that's kind of what I want to try and build, and I know that was more explanation, but I wanted to kind of just give you guys the idea about how the Entity framework kind of uses this ChangeTracker as an extra area where it kind of stores data locally in memory until you call the save changes at some point. And when that save changes is called, then it actually goes and create from this ChangeTracker an SQL request that can save the data to a database, and then it returns some kind of reply. And actually also when it returns that reply, it says unmodified right here, or unchanged, changes the state into unchanged right here actually behind the scenes to explain that now this object has been fixed. So that was just a quick introduction to how it actually works behind the scenes with the Entity framework core, and now we're going to try and actually model that in our tests in the next lesson. See you next time. Have fun.